Singapore is one of the smallest countries in the world, and yet it's also one of the most successful. Lying at a strategically vital crossroads, it's emerged as an economic powerhouse. However, it had a difficult beginning. Its independence from Malaysia was one of the most interesting cases of state creation in modern international politics. Indeed, it's often seen as unique. Singapore is the only state to have been created by being forced out of another country. But is this an entirely accurate picture of what actually happened? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. We tend to think that countries will resist the loss of territory at all costs. Modern international relations shows that very few states are willing to accept the independence of a breakaway region. But what happens if a state in fact wants to lose a piece of land? In truth, it's almost unknown. While countries may reluctantly accept that a piece of territory wants to secede, there are remarkably few instances where a country has actively wanted to get rid of part of its territory. Indeed, it's widely accepted that there's only one example of this in modern international politics: Singapore's expulsion from Malaysia in 1965. And yet, as we'll see, it wasn't quite as straightforward as it might seem. The island of Singapore lies just off the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. At around 721 square kilometres or 280 square miles, it ranks 175th out of the 193 members of the United Nations. Its population currently stands at 5.45 million. This is made up of a diverse mixture of national groups. The largest community are ethnic Chinese, representing around 3/4 of the population. Then there are Malays and ethnic Indians, representing 15% and 7.5% respectively. The remaining 1.5% or so are Europeans, Eurasians and other communities. Although Singapore has a long history of settlement, the story really begins in 1819 when Sir Stamford Raffles, a British official, established a trading post on the then sparsely inhabited island. Sitting at a crucial junction between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, in the years that followed, Singapore joined and later became the administrative centre for other British settlements established on the Malay Peninsula along the strategically significant Strait of Malacca. In the decades that followed, Britain extended its influence over the rest of the peninsula as various sultanates came under its protection. In 1895, a group of these were amalgamated to form the Federated Malay States. These sat alongside the Strait settlements and a group of 5 other individual protectorates, collectively known as the Unfederated Malay States. Meanwhile, the population of Singapore grew rapidly. Numbering just a couple of hundred people when the trading post was first established, within 5 years the island's inhabitants had passed 10,000. By 1901, this had reached 225,000 people, rising to over 500,000 by 1931. While this growth was driven by Malay and Indian immigration, almost from the start, the largest single community were ethnic Chinese. During the Second World War, the Malay Peninsula, including Singapore, was occupied by Japanese forces. However, following the resumption of British rule, the territories were reorganised. On the 1st of April 1946, Singapore ceased to be part of the Strait settlements and became a British Crown colony in its own right. Meanwhile, the remaining Strait settlements, along with the federated and unfederated Malay states, were amalgamated, becoming the Federation of Malaya on the 1st of February 1948. As a result, Singapore now sat apart from the Malay Peninsula, not only geographically but also administratively, and over the next decade and a half achieved greater self-rule. However, questions were growing about its future, especially as by this point the process of British decolonisation was in full swing. This issue became even more pressing when, on the 31st of August 1957, the neighbouring Federation became independent. Despite its status as a standalone Crown colony, many in Singapore saw its place within the newly independent Federation. While there was little obvious economic advantage to the Union, the general view was that Singapore, as a small island, couldn't survive on its own. In contrast, the political leaders in the Federation were cautious about any unification. Singapore's population was larger than that of the Federation. They worried about the implications of 3.6 million Chinese outnumbering the 3.4 million Malays in a united country. However, in the end, they were persuaded by wider political concerns. Against the backdrop of an ongoing communist insurgency in the region, many feared that without protection, Singapore might be overrun. In April 1961, Kuan, the Prime Minister of Singapore, proposed the creation of a new state, Malaysia. This would be made up of the Federation, Singapore, and 3 other territories still under British rule on the neighbouring island of Borneo, Brunei, and the colonies of Sarawak and North Borneo. 7 months later, in November 1961, and in consultation with the British government, the creation of the Federation of Malaysia was agreed. On the 1st of September 1962, a controversial referendum was held in Singapore, offering voters 3 choices on the form of integration, but not on the merger itself. In the end, they chose considerable autonomy instead of the other 2 models that envisaged either a complete and unconditional merger or a merger on terms equal to the other new entrants. In the year that followed, the details of the union were outlined. Singapore would be represented in the federal administration and would contribute accordingly to the state budget. On top of this, it was agreed that a common market would be established, ensuring open trade between the parts of Malaysia. On the 31st of August 1963, British rule officially came to an end, and just over 2 weeks later, on the 16th of September, Singapore became one of the 14 states of the newly created Federation of Malaysia, alongside Sabah and Sarawak on the island of Borneo. In the end, Brunei, the 4th territory that was to have joined, opted to stay out of the Federation. It would remain a British protectorate until it gained its independence in 1984. From the start, the union proved to be a difficult relationship, both economically and politically. While it was always clear that there were significant differences between the 2 entities, these were magnified following Singapore's entry into the Federation. Singapore became unhappy at the failure to implement the common market. Meanwhile, Malaysia felt that Singapore wasn't meeting its financial obligations. Moreover, Malaysia's political leadership was angered by the decision of Singapore's ruling People's Action Party to contest seats in Malaysia in the April 1964 general election, a move seen by the United Malays National Organisation, the dominant party in the rest of the Federation, as an encroachment on their political territory. It was against this backdrop that ethnic tensions now began to grow between the Malays and Chinese. This came to a head in July and September 1964 when rioting broke out in Singapore that left 36 dead and over 550 injured. By the end of the year, relations between the politicians and the people of Singapore and the rest of Malaysia were under intolerable strain, and the Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, now made it clear that if Singapore's politicians continued their path, then the only route was for Singapore to leave the Federation. That said, soon afterwards, he outlined an idea for a form of confederation. Singapore would have full autonomy in all areas except for defence and foreign policy in return for giving up its seats in the Federation. However, the discussions on this looser arrangement failed to produce a credible plan. Instead, in the months that followed, the differences grew. By July 1965, Rahman had decided that the only remaining option was to force Singapore out of the Federation. Clearly, this had the potential to lead to major complications had Singapore refused. However, by this stage, it seems that Singapore's Prime Minister Kuan had also reached the conclusion that a separation was the only viable way out. To this end, the sides held top-secret talks on the terms of divorce. Indeed, even many members of the governments in Malaysia and Singapore were kept in the dark about the negotiations. Just weeks later, the sides reached a deal. On the morning of the 9th of August 1965, less than 2 years after it had joined Malaysia, and in a move that surprised ordinary Malaysians and Singaporeans alike, a law for Singapore's separation was unanimously passed by the Malaysian Parliament. Taking direct personal responsibility for the decision, Rahman said that there had been no other choice. It had been needed for peace. At the very same time, a visibly upset Kuan broke down as he declared Singapore's independence. Calling on people to be calm, he promised that there was nothing to fear. Singapore would be a multi-ethnic state. 6 weeks later, on the 21st of September 1965, the Republic of Singapore became the 117th member of the United Nations. What made the separation particularly interesting was that, at least at the time, it was widely regarded as a temporary move based on the differences of the main political forces. It wasn't in fact seen as a permanent parting of the ways driven by some sort of fundamental incompatibility between Malaysia and Singapore. To that end, the door was in fact left open for eventual reunification. Indeed, at the time, it appeared as though many saw this as inevitable. As Rahman noted, Singapore would be welcomed back at some point. Indeed, he would later express his regret at having let Singapore go. Likewise, Lee Kuan Yew also sounded a note of regret about how things turned out. He too left the door open for a new settlement, stating that it would be up to the next generation to bring about reunification. Of course, this never happened. It's now almost 60 years since the countries separated, and there appears to be no organised movement for reunification, although the idea is still sometimes floated. Nevertheless, it's interesting to consider that, despite everything that had happened, there was still a sense that Singapore's place was really within the wider union of other territories that had come together to form Malaysia. We often think that states will do anything to hold on to land. However, just occasionally we encounter a situation where a country appears willing to be rid of a troublesome territory. One of the most interesting such cases in modern international politics was Malaysia's decision to expel Singapore. As seen, in many ways, Singapore's incorporation into Malaysia was never entirely comfortable. Despite the many common ties, there were in fact fundamental political and economic differences that quickly made the union uncomfortable for both parties. However, ultimately, the situation was resolved peacefully and relatively easily. And it wasn't quite the dramatic expulsion that many often think it was. Although Malaysia wanted to be rid of Singapore, it was clear that Singapore was ready to accept the decision and go its own way. In this sense, and contrary to the view many outsiders often have, while it was indeed an expulsion, it could equally be regarded as a consensual mutual secession. In this sense, it raises a fascinating question about what would happen if a state did in fact try to expel a territory that didn't in fact want to accept independence. I hope you found that interesting. If so, here are some more videos that you might like. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.